Russian is the largest European language in terms of native speakers and has over 250 million speakers worldwide, placing it in the top 10 most spoken languages. It was once spoken across the vast Russian Empire, and we want to look at how far its influence is still felt across its former colonies after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And how is Russian viewed on the global stage? The Kremlin wants to push the narrative that it's the language of Dostoyevsky, Tolstoy, Pasternak and Nabokov, but it's increasingly also associated with Russian military expansionism. And we'll also be discussing how it competes with Arabic as the language of international jihad. What's the state of this once dominant world language? Is the Russian language in decline? There's a Russian saying, where Russian is present, Russia must also be present. So our first question today is, where is Russian in widespread use?
Język rosyjski w tym momencie jest przede wszystkim
Russian is currently the main national and official language in Russia, alongside the languages of the ethnic minorities which also have official status. Russian is also the official language of Belarus, and these are the two countries where this language is truly dominant.
główne państwa, gdzie ten język rzeczywiście dominuje.
Outside of Russia and Belarus, the situation is more complicated. Besides the parastates under Russia's protection, it also has official recognition in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. But how well do people really know the language in the former Soviet Union?
Mam wrażenie i to wrażenie
I have the impression, and repeated visits confirm this, that people speak Russian less in the South Caucasus than in Central Asia. And there are differences between the countries. For example, in Armenia, okay, not everyone, but everyone in the capital, Yerevan, speaks at least some Russian. It's harder to use it in the provinces, but there too, there's never been a situation where you can't get by in Russian. However, in Georgia or in Azerbaijan, unlike in Armenia, it's a little tougher, even though there too it's a pretty widespread language. Central Asia is different. In my experience, knowledge of Russian is higher here. Everywhere I've been, and I visit all 5 Central Asian republics regularly, both in the provinces and the capitals, I think the level of Russian is still quite high.
uważam za wciąż dość wysoki.
Ukraine was also in the Soviet Union, but we'll discuss that country in more detail later in this film. For now, let's look at the furthest flung parts of the former Soviet bloc, the countries of Central Europe.
Widzimy taki proces odchodzenia od nauczania języka rosyjskiego.
We're seeing a process of people turning away from learning Russian in Eastern Europe. In the Warsaw Pact countries, Russian used to be compulsory in schools. The move away from it was gradual. First, it stopped being compulsory, but it was the first foreign language that one could study. Then it became the second optional language to study. At present, data from Poland's Ministry of Education shows that barely 2,000 schools still teach Russian. I think politics is partly behind the reason to reject Russian right now, but there are also practical reasons. Looking at relations between Russia and Europe and Poland and Europe, it doesn't seem likely that Russian would be useful in a future career, so this discourages students. This decline isn't only seen in Poland. It's similar in the Czech Republic, where they're also moving away from Russian in schools. English is more popular, German too, so the Russian language is slowly becoming obsolete.
Język rosyjski po prostu odchodzi do lamusa.
But how did Russian become established across the region? What historical policies were used?
Natomiast przez to, że Rosja była obecna
It's because Russia was there for hundreds of years. The conquest of the Caucasus was completed in the 1830s, so it's been 200 years, minus the 30 years of those countries' post-Soviet independence. So there's been some generations who've been in contact with Russian or who had to learn it. In Central Asia, the conquest took a little longer, but it was basically finished at the end of the 19th century, so there's a number of generations who studied Russian at school. The men served in the Soviet army, where they very quickly learned Russian, even if they barely spoke Russian at all when they were called up. Russian television was very widely available after the fall of the USSR, and it was considered much better than the local television of the individual Central Asian countries. And Russia was a destination for workers, and it still is a location for migrant laborers.
Mówię o migracji zarobkowej.
And there are also the darker historical aspects of peoples moving around the region.
No i też musimy pamiętać cały czas o zesłaniach, które...
And we also need to remember about people being sent in exile to Kazakhstan. This means Russian still has a very strong position.
Język rosyjski jest na silnej pozycji.
It was similar in Ukraine.
No to były jednak wieki rusyfikacji.
There were centuries of Russification, and it certainly didn't start in the Soviet Union. It was even earlier. When we're talking about linguistic issues, we can provide countless examples, but in the 19th century there were various ukazy, decrees, the Valuyev Circular, the Ems ukaz. These are very important events in the history of the Ukrainian language when the Tsarist authorities banned publications in Ukrainian. Later, the Soviet policy, so far as its purpose was concerned, was very similar, if not identical, to the imperial Tsarist policy. But as time passed, and especially as technology advanced, it became more large-scale in nature.
Ona przybrała po prostu znacznie bardziej masowy charakter.
There was a period of promoting the Ukrainian language, though.
Była ta polityka ukrainizacji na przełomie lat 20. i 30.
There was the policy of Ukrainianization at the turn of the 1920s and 30s. It was connected to the liberalization policy, the so-called New Economic Policy, when the Soviets opened up because the USSR was weakened by the First World War and the Revolution, and it needed to earn some money. To simplify it as much as possible, it needed to open up and introduce some free market mechanisms, and this was linked to some social, educational liberalization. The idea was that they could use the Ukrainian language to sneak in communist messages in order to tie these separate nations to the idea of a communist state, to the idea of living in one joint country. Unfortunately, the reaction to it was very severe. The great flowering of Ukrainian culture at the turn of the 20s and 30s would later become the generation known as the executed Renaissance. The majority of these people would face repression in the 1930s and often simply died, either in the Gulag or simply by being shot in the head. In this film, we're discussing the role language plays in conquest. But what about the technical aspects? With its complex grammatical system, Russian is famously a difficult language to learn. So perhaps part of the reason it spread can be found in the Kremlin's propaganda that, for example, Ukrainian is nothing more than an inferior dialect of Russian, so-called Lesser Russian.
No są podobne, dlatego że to są języki wschodniosłowiańskie.
They are similar because Ukrainian, Russian and Belarusian are East Slavic languages. But they're not the same and obviously have differences. They have different grammatical inflections. They're pronounced differently. For anyone who knows those languages, it's obvious they're absolutely different languages.
Ну это ладно, мелочи, замотался в круговерте светской жизни и забыл, бывает. Хобі у сина Пескова, як у англійського аристократа.
Ну і в тому числі, хто переніс важкі хвороби з серцем, також зможуть тут відновлювати своє життя.
Мне здаецца, што 1 верасня неяк асабліва адгукаецца ў кожным сэрцы.
Yes, Ukrainians understand Russian, but that's in large part simply because that area and those generations of Ukrainians were Russified, and it was inevitable they'd understand Russian to some degree. While Ukrainians understand Russian, Russians don't really understand Ukrainian. This isn't because the Russians are handicapped in linguistic terms. It's because of the centuries of Russification.
Przez stulecia rusyfikacji.
In the case of the other former Soviet states, there is no way the Kremlin can pretend the local languages are just low-quality dialects of Russian.
Język rosyjski nie jest podobny do żadnego z języków.
Russian is not similar to any of the languages of the Caucasus or Central Asia. The Caucasus has the titular nations, the Georgians, the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis, and their languages are all in different language groups. Both Armenian and Russian are Indo-European Indo-European languages, but that's where the similarity ends. First off, the Armenian alphabet is entirely different. It's not Latin, it's not Cyrillic. They have their own, which is only used for Armenian. Of course, there are some individual words which may be similar due to the geographical proximity, but they're different languages. As for Georgian, it's a totally different language group. It's an indigenous Caucasian language of the local Kartvelian branch, and Azerbaijani is a Turkic language, just like most of the countries of Central Asia, where there's Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Uzbek, Turkmen. And there's one Indo-European language in Central Asia, Tajik. It's related to Farsi, to Persian spoken in Iran, and yes, it's an Indo-European language, like Russian. But talking about a similarity here is like comparing, I don't know, Polish to English, since they're both Indo-European languages. Even with such different languages, Russification may give the impression that the languages are much more similar than they actually are.
Język kazachski zupełnie nie jest pokrewny.
Kazakh is not related to Russian in the slightest, nor is it similar to it. In linguistic terms, they're quite separate, but Kazakh is written in Cyrillic, which might make them look similar when written down. And Kazakh still has a lot of words taken from Russian. Regardless, they're still very distant to each other.
Są od siebie dosyć odległe.
But the policies to dilute the influence of the local culture in Kazakhstan were certainly successful.
W momencie, w którym Kazachstan w roku 1991
When Kazakhstan gained independence in 1991, Kazakhs were a minority there. According to census data, they made up around 40% of the population, so the Kazakhs were a minority in their own country. We need to remember that Russian, during Soviet times too, was a more prestigious language. It was the language of education, of culture, and this made it very difficult for the Kazakh language. Of course, later on in the 90s, there were some demographic changes which made Kazakhs a majority in Kazakhstan. At present, it's around 70% of citizens.
W tym momencie mówimy o 70% obywateli.
This led to efforts to rediscover their national identity.
To w przypadku takiego najbardziej ambitnego
There's the Balashak program, the most ambitious scholarship scheme. It means future in Kazakh, and they allow young people to study abroad. I see these young people cutting themselves off from Russian universities. The authorities want to send young people to the West, especially to the US, but also to England to study. The European countries are a less popular choice, and further still are, of course, the best Russian universities, but they're far less popular.
to jest jednak dalszy wybór.
The country which has seen the most change in recent years is, of course, Ukraine. The peak of its Russification could be seen when the USSR collapsed.
Ukraina w 1991 roku czy w 1992?
In 1991-1992, people didn't speak Ukrainian in Ukraine as much as now. Socially speaking, there was really nothing wrong with speaking Russian. Russian was seen as our Ukrainian language. I'm not saying Ukrainian was in decline, but it wasn't generally viewed as the language of social advancement. Russian was still seen as the language of high culture, of big business, big money. Young people growing up at that time looked at the Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, and didn't see how they could help them earn money with their career and so on. Quite the opposite. So I see this as a delayed success of Russification.
Późny sukces rusyfikacji.
Independence saw a reverse in this trend.
Od samego początku niepodległego państwa proces edukacji.
From the very start of the independent state, the education process was in Ukrainian. So the departure from Russian really began then, and it was a top-down process within the system. It was a different story outside the education system.
Było poza systemem edukacyjnym.
This led to a strange situation where Ukrainian literature was, in large part, confined to narrow intellectual groups, while the majority of the population continued to enjoy literature, movies, TV shows, and pop music in Russian, which was much more widely available and, partly due to measures taken by the Kremlin, also easily accessible. This period of Russia's soft power in Ukraine lasted for over 2 decades.
Wraz z tym, jak Rosja po raz pierwszy zaatakowała Ukrainę.
When Russia attacked Ukraine in 2014 and then later with the full-scale invasion in 2022, Russia's soft power in Ukraine was blown to pieces. Russia is not even an option. We could say that in the 1990s or the 2000s, people would think, you know Russian, you can go to Russia, have a good career and so on. But now Russia isn't associated with Moscow. Now Russia is associated with Bucha, with Mariupol, and with Irpin. But the influence of Russian is not falling everywhere in the region. There is one unexpected area where it is actually increasing its global impact.
Bardzo ciekawym elementem czy wymiarem jakby tej płaszczyzny jest to...
One interesting aspect of the Russian language is Islamic radicalism. It's present in the post-Soviet area. We see traces of it in Central Asia, and even more so with its proponents from the region leaving for the Middle East, also in the attacks they carry out in Western Europe. Islamic radicals are also present in the North Caucasus and partly in the South Caucasus. It's interesting that a significant proportion of them are radicalized in the Russian Federation, in the Russian language. It's their lingua franca. Debates about Islamic radicalism are possible in Russian. The literature is available and the people are available. Why would Russian be preferred to Arabic, which is the doctrinal language of Islam?
Problem jest taki, że on jest niedostępny czy trudno zrozumiały dla...
The problem is that it's inaccessible. It's hard for people to understand if they haven't studied Arabic. So for the majority of the post-Soviet area, their normal language of communication, for normal comprehension, is more Russian than Arabic. Arabic is rather confined to scripture, the Quran, for prayer, for those types of things. Their knowledge of Arabic certainly improved when they traveled to fight with Islamic State in Syria, in Iraq, but I don't believe their knowledge of Arabic is sufficient to enter into deeper discussions, understanding or studies. And we shouldn't expect that from jihadis, from manual laborers working, for example, in Russia. This still doesn't explain why these migrant workers do not use their native languages instead of Russian.
Tamte państwa w Azji Centralnej wprowadziły dosyć efektywny system kontroli.
Those countries in Central Asia have introduced a fairly effective system of monitoring radical content. It's hard to become radicalized in Central Asia, but for the many millions of migrant laborers or other visitors to Russia, the opportunity exists there. They have access to radical materials. In addition to this, immigrants often suffer from alienation or different forms of persecution, which make them more likely to search for other types of content, including radical content. This creates a common denominator which can unite the Tajiks with the Chechens or the Dagestanis with the Kyrgyz. This is not the only way Russian links the peoples of the region.
Ale język rosyjski cały czas jest uznawany za język...
Regardless, Russian is still seen as a language for contacts between the ethnic groups in Kazakhstan, meaning in situations, let's say at the street market, when members of different national groups present in Kazakhstan are having a conversation. It will most likely be in Russian. I can talk from personal experience here. I did Turkic studies at university and I took a Kazakh language course in Kazakhstan. And I had problems studying it since very often I would repeatedly attempt to start a conversation in Kazakh. But people prefer to answer me in Russian because the Kazakhs don't seem to be used to non-Kazakhs knowing or trying to speak Kazakh.
Albo próbują posługiwać się językiem kazachskim.
However, sometimes avoiding the local language can be an advantage.
Mój dobry znajomy z Tadżykistanu, informatyk, który
A good friend of mine, who's an IT specialist from Tajikistan, told me a story about when he was installing a computer network at the university in Mazar-i-Sharif in Afghanistan over a few weeks. He'd graduated in Poland and he wasn't an Orthodox Muslim, and at some point he felt like drinking alcohol. We know there's prohibition in Afghanistan, but he found out that there were 2 shops on the edge of town where you can buy alcohol. So he went to the first shop and asked if he could buy some. He asked in Tajik, which is very similar to Farsi, and the reaction was fierce. They treated him as a provocateur. So he went to the next shop, and here he asked the same question in Russian, and this time he got the alcohol.
No i dostał ten alkohol.
We can see that Russian is holding on in the region, but the trend is nevertheless a downward one. And surprisingly, the first line of defense is inside the Russian Federation.
Państwo rosyjskie przykłada wielką wagę do języka.
The Russian state treats the language very seriously as a factor which can integrate Russian society, which is very varied. It doesn't only have ethnic Russians, but lots of other language groups, ethnic groups, and they have their own languages, which are recognized as official languages. The Russian state would like to bind together this diverse society, which speaks different languages and has different religions. The Russian language and the state media are elements intended to consolidate this society. And they're following an active policy of changing the law, which is aimed, for example, at integrating Russian society, economic migrants, actually all immigrants coming to Russia, but especially economic migrants, who are the subject of heated debate in Russia.
When it was discovered that the March 2024 Crocus City Hall terrorist attack had been committed by immigrants, the government sought to placate the Russian public by introducing draconian laws against foreign languages.
Już od dawna w Rosji imigranci zarobkowi musieli zdobywać certyfikaty językowe.
For a long time now, Russian migrant workers have been required to get language certificates to confirm they know the language. But now it's going to be harder to get those certificates. They've introduced recommendations stating that immigrants cannot even whisper in their native languages in public places, like public transport. They can't use traditional phrases. For example, people from Central Asia often call each other brother or sister, and that's banned in Russia, and Russians approve of it.
Outside of Russia, initially a softer approach was taken.
Bo dla Kremla język rosyjski jest...
Because the Kremlin sees the Russian language as a soft power instrument, which it can use to increase its influence. For years, the Kremlin established organizations in a systemic way. It created an entire toolkit to promote Russian and to use it to familiarize Russian culture and in general to bring societies of foreign language countries closer to Russia.
The organizations established to achieve this goal have faced challenges.
Szereg rosyjskich instrumentów, które Kreml tworzył latami po to,
The Kremlin spent years creating all those different instruments to promote the Russian language, Russian culture, and Russian Orthodox Christianity worldwide. But Russia's aggression saw them being sanctioned and led to the opposite effect of what they'd intended. These include organizations such as the Russian World Foundation and Rossotudnichestwo, which is a state agency aimed at integrating Russian language diasporas. I think that now most people are aware that these are political instruments and not neutral organizations interested in culture. In my opinion, this policy has failed because the Russian aggression against Ukraine, which was launched with the excuse that it was defending Russian-speaking people, defending the Russian language, laid bare Russia's real intentions, i.e., that language is just a political issue and an excuse to launch aggressive action.
The Kremlin would claim that it had no choice but to shift from soft power to hard power to defend the repressed Russian speakers of Ukraine.
Prześladowani to jest bardzo mocne słowo.
Repression is a very strong word. If they're repressed, it would mean they are being punished, that there are trials, they're in prison. From a legal standpoint, there are, of course, clauses about how Russian can't be used in public spaces, that adverts can't be in Russian, that civil servants can't speak Russian. But I've never heard of a case of any real punishment for these actions, that anyone has ever been sentenced for speaking Russian.
Skazany za mówienie w języku rosyjskim.
In fact, it's easy to disprove the Kremlin's claims that Ukraine's Russian speakers are nothing more than a repressed ethnic minority forced to integrate into a foreign Ukrainian culture.
Część osób, patriotów.
There are some patriots who take a very clear pro-Ukrainian stance, but even they still use Russian, because it's their native first language that they use at home. They use it on social media, they write Facebook posts in Russian.
Специально запишу по-русски, чтобы было, понятнее. Шо, ребята, как дела?
And nobody says anything about that. You can speak Russian freely on the street, and you can hear it in Ukraine's city streets. And not only in eastern Ukraine or in Kyiv.
Tam na wschodniej Ukrainie czy w Kijowie.
But there is one country where the freedom of expression in the Russian language is heavily restricted, and where writers can face severe punishments.
To w Rosji ta cenzura rzeczywiście przybiera taki bardzo radykalny charakter.
It's in Russia, where the censorship is very radical. Recently, a famous Russian crime writer was sentenced to years in prison because of his extreme views. He was recognized as being a terrorist in Russia. We can see here that while the Kremlin sees nothing wrong in punishing artists in their own country, they still criticize what's happening in the West. So I think for many authors, emigrating was the making of them. Dmitry Gluchovsky, who is a clear critic of Putin's aggressive policies, is very popular in Europe. There are organized meetings with him. He's very active publicly. These are important moral voices from Russian society which unambiguously condemn the aggression, and I think they create sympathy for those Russians who've chosen to stand up to the Kremlin.
Of course, it's not only authors. Countless Russians and Belarusians have fled domestic repression, many of them heading to Western Europe. Along with Ukrainians escaping the Russian war machine, this has seen a rare expansion of the Russian language.
Ten proces, taki krótkofalowy i bardziej doraźny, doprowadził do tego, że
This short-term process has led to a temporary situation where we're hearing the Russian language spoken in public places where it has never before been heard. Vilnius or Warsaw are great examples of this change. If we go for a walk through the center of Warsaw, we can hear a lot of Russian now. This is partly because of the Russians who've left Russia, settling in different cities, but also people from Ukraine and Belarus who have left those countries know Russian and use it. And as émigrés, they find it easier to use Russian in their daily lives.
tym językiem również się posługiwać.
And in fact, Russian culture, repressed in its homeland, is thriving in exile.
W kontrze do tego, co Kreml mówi na temat wszechobecnej rusofobii.
Although the Kremlin likes to talk about the omnipresent Russophobia in the West, especially in Western Europe, in fact we see something totally different in European streets. In Warsaw, in Berlin, in France, there are very many concerts of independent bands and theatrical performances. There are various kinds of meetings with comedians and journalists. I think anyone traveling to Berlin can easily find a Russian language event every week, every day even, and freely participate in them. There's no such freedom in Russia.
W Rosji takiej swobody absolutnie nie ma.
The fall of the Soviet Union and the accompanied national renaissances loosened the stranglehold the Russian language had on the region. Putin's foreign policy miscalculations have accelerated the trend. But as we have shown, Russian is still an important regional language. In some cases, though, it can feel like this once vast linguistic empire is disappearing.
Rzadko zdajemy sobie sprawę, że takie kwestie bardzo...
We very rarely consider how these issues impact on individuals. I can tell you about my friend, a rock musician from Tashkent. He's Armenian, but was born in Central Asia. Even his parents were born there, but his grandparents are from Nagorno-Karabakh. He speaks foreign languages. He has great English and knows other languages, including Japanese. But his native language that he learned at home is Russian, and he writes poems in that language. He writes in that language. He sings in Russian. But he told me this: I can't go to Russia because I oppose the war. I've spoken out against it many times, so I'd be arrested. But I can't go to Ukraine because I sing in Russian. I can't go to Armenia because I don't speak Armenian. I can't go to Azerbaijan because I'm an Armenian. So where does that leave me? All of a sudden, a man who'd considered himself to be a cosmopolitan, who felt at home in many different places, has now found his world has shrunk around him dramatically.
W różnych miejscach, nagle jego świat się potwornie skurczył.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this film, why not try the ones you can see on screen now?